Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son?
As I'm getting a little bit older and more experienced as a production designer, I try to let the film tell me what it wants to be.
They should just let me be.
Let you be what?
Whatever it is they don't want me to be.
It wasn't really a set as much as it was a time machine.
He dropped in on us out of nowhere and he played us a song.
Every time I have a kitchen in a set, I'll actually make a meal the night before.
That's how I got so far.
Good start.
Hi, I'm Paula Benson, founder and editor of Film and Furniture. Today on the Film and Furniture podcast, we explore the design and spaces of a complete unknown with the film's production designer, François Audouy.
By now.
Directed by James Mangold and starring Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan, join us as we explore how a complete unknown captures Bob Dylan's journey from a young songwriter to becoming a cultural icon. And it takes us on a journey through early 60s cultural epicenters like Greenwich Village streets, bars, apartments and small clubs, to Columbia Records, Pete Seeger's cabin, the gorgeous mid-century house of Joan Baez, and various defining music festival performances. This podcast works just as well without visuals, but just to let you know, it's a video podcast, so you can watch along too for the full experience. By the way, this interview contains spoilers.
But don't think twice, it's all right.
I hear some congratulations is in order for your nomination.
Thank you very much. That just happened about 45 minutes ago.
Amazing. We're on it.
You are on it.
A Complete Unknown, it immerses us in the early 1960s. And this is a very interesting cultural time, right? But it's before the time of kind of hippiedom and flower power and, all the bright colours and fashions and things that some people immediately think of when you think of the 60s. But this is kind of before all that happened, right?
Well, it's even deeper than that, in that one thing that I learned about this time period is that the early 60s and the mid-60s changed every year in very profound ways. And what the movie is really about is about witnessing the very epicenter of that cultural change happening. So the changes from 1961 to 1965 are incredibly profound. And it's about the change in American culture and how that happened through the confluence of music and art and all of this change happening. In our story, it happened in Greenwich Village in New York City. And so it's about witnessing that. So I really wanted to put the audience in the middle of all of that artistic upheaval, if you will. The very first note that I got on this project was from Bob Dylan via Jim Mangold. Jim Mangold had several very in-depth meetings with Bob Dylan during the pandemic as they were developing this project. And Bob told Jim, or Mr. Dylan, told Jim, the early 1960s are still the 1950s. And what he meant by that is that, to your point, 1961 and 1962 still felt like the 1950s. American Graffiti is a film that was set in 1962, but everyone thinks that's a 1950s movie.
Yeah.
Even the cars and the fashion hadn't really evolved to what we think of as the 1960s. So we could really dissect the change that was happening year by year, because our film takes place from January 1961 all the way to 1965. And you're really witnessing that change and evolution happening, and you're seeing the birth of the 1960s that we know today. It was a very, very exciting and challenging period to really explore.
Yeah, and such an incredible pivotal time. And I guess, the times, they were a-changing. But it started really in all these kind of small venues and small kind of hubs. So we've got, these scenes of small cafes and small folk clubs and quite bohemian sort of small apartments. So a lot of it is taking place in very small sectors of a small community. And I was thinking about the street scenes, because a street is where people bump into each other, right? And it's often the case that ideas are exchanged. And I love the fact that there are so many street scenes in Greenwich Village and Bleecker and other places where you really get the feeling that, ideas might have been sort of moving around quite quickly.
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. A lot of times the pitfall with these period films is to create an architectural sort of recreation of a time in history. And I see a lot of designers get distracted by the architecture. What I really wanted to do was connect to the feeling of what it was to walk down these streets and the people who lived there. I mean, Greenwich Village is a very small section of Lower Manhattan. But at the time, you had all of these artists, poets like Dylan Thomas and Allen Ginsberg, and painters like Edward Hopper, and writers like Jack Kerouac. They're all living and working shoulder to shoulder and going to the same pubs and the same folk clubs, the same restaurants and cafes, and everything happening. And it was really like a petri dish where they're all being influenced and they're all tapped into what was happening. And Bob found himself there at 19 years old. This is a person who was so tapped into the news and culture and music and art. He was really plugged in, and you could feel that connection to American society in his music. He was listening and feeling it and rebroadcasting it through his lyrics and through his music. So he was as much a product of the village as the village was a product of Bob Dylan. There was this symbiotic relationship between the artists who were living there and the place. Yeah, the streets were incredibly challenging and exciting to recreate. And it was also an exercise in giving backstory to all the storefronts and giving all of these extras something to do. In a lot of movies, you have extras show up and they're just random people and just cross frame. In our movie, and this is from Jim Mangold, he really created layering where there's the pickle vendor selling pickles on the corner, and there's, a tambourine man on a carpet, and there's all of these layers, and they all have stories. Everybody has stories. I was really inspired by Dean Tavares' work on the Godfather films. I thought those films are really the high bar of street scenes, and I wanted to sort of lean into that sort of approach of like classical cinema, of really making these scenes feel real.
Yeah, that really comes across so well. And also the colour themes as well, I thought were really interesting. And I was wondering what sort of research you did to try and ground us in that time.
I was really inspired by the Kodachrome photography of like Saul Leader and Ernest Haas and Todd Papageorge, who've captured New York City in the early 1960s. But as I was prepping this movie, I didn't want to force a look onto the film from the beginning. And as I'm getting a little bit older and more experienced as a production designer, I try to let the film tell me what it wants to be. What I mean by that is that you have to be sensitive to the discoveries and to the collaboration that's happening around you, especially for a film like this. I mean, and everybody was so passionate about this story and about this film. Even the actors, Ed Norton, who plays Pete Seeger, on his own, he went and met with the Seeger family and Seeger's daughter and went to their cabin. We had some black and white photography that we were working on. But 2 days before we opened the set, he said, they had red appliances. And I said, what do you mean? His daughter told me that they had Freedom Red appliances, and it was sort of a joke in the family about the commie red appliances that Pete Seeger had. And they would joke about it. And I thought that was so terrific. So we sourced a 1950s red enamel stove for that kitchen and then painted the matching refrigerator red. And it just created this incredibly rich palette where I'd never even heard of red appliances before, but they were a thing in a very specific period of time in America. And so that was a very early scene that we had done, but it gave me permission to use red as an accent throughout the film. So we have this Kodachrome red that kind of plays a role in the palette of the film. That was a very late addition to the palette. I worked very, very closely with Regina Graves, who was our set decorator and who's absolutely brilliant. And in New York, the set decorators have a very similar role as in London, meaning that they are very involved in the final surface finishes, and they have a construction role as well, finishing the surfaces. So we worked very, very closely in developing that palette that was reminiscent of some of the early 1960s photography, but also inspired by the pieces that she would find and some of these like iconic interiors that we wanted to recreate.
Yeah, interesting, this idea of colour, because actually a lot of the
was black and white at that time as well. Did you ever consider shooting in black and white?
We did. We talked about that for about a minute with Paula Michael and Jim Mangold. But Jim didn't want to make a film that was distracting in its stylization. And I think what I'm most proud of is that the setting kind of just washes over you, and it's very immersive. It's a very immersive feeling. And his style of filmmaking is not distracting in that we're really staying with the characters, and we don't cut to a high, wide crane shot for no reason. It's like some of these other films that are period films are like, look at us, look at all this stuff. It's very story driven. And I think that was the film that we were trying to make.
Just coming back to the street scenes for a moment, if we may, there's lots of scenes of walking down streets. So you're seeing a lot of buildings and a lot of shops. And I loved all that because it made me really want to be in the 60s in New York, really. But then also the signage, I guess, had a really important part to play. So you're seeing all these shops and all places with the names and the typography.
Yeah.
I thought that was all, I loved all that. Can you tell us more about it?
You really know the film, Paula. Thank you. I came up as being a graphic designer 30 years ago. And so graphics are very important to me. We had a 4-person graphics team making thousands of signs for this film. And they were all handmade and hand painted. This texture in this film is pushed a little bit more than the historical, book report version. I really wanted to feel like all the signage was handmade and hand painted. So we would put the paint brushes and the peeling paint into the files themselves. And then all of the hero signage that was close to camera would be done by hand, by classical sort of sign writers, and painted graphics on the windows and all of that stuff. This was a world where the signage was all hand done. There was no CNC or vinyl cutting. So it was all layered. And a lot of times you could see the layers of the earlier businesses coming through. But the signage, I think, does a lot of work to immerse the audience into the period, along with the cars, which we had thousands of cars, and the costumes by Ariane Phillips. It's a team effort, to create that world that works, that you just accept.
And the folk ethic, I guess, of things being done by hand, not too much plastic or neon or all that sort of thing. I thought it was really beautiful.
We had a lot of neon, but it was all tube neon,
school.
All made by hand. The neon that existed, just in like the 1940s, 50s style. In fact, I found an old book on manufacturing neon from like 1938 that we used so that we made all the neon in the same way as they would have made it in the 1950s, I suppose.
The set decoration team of A Complete Unknown, headed up by Regina Graves, spent a huge amount of time studying photos of Bob Dylan's apartment and recreated it with meticulous detail. We spotted some vintage furniture, record players and typewriters with a very interesting story to tell. Find out exactly what they are and where to find your own, as well as hundreds of items of furniture and decor spotted in film in our marketplace at filmandfurniture.com. Find the links in the description below. And thanks to Regina Grace for all insider information on these amazing details.
So, can we talk about Bob Dylan's apartment? Oh my God, my eyes were darting everywhere around that apartment. I'm sure the average viewer isn't, but film and furniture fans probably do. So you created this in a stage set, right?
Well, we did both, actually. And 80% of it is shot on stage in an immersive way. But we also recreated 3 walls of the space on location for scenes of Bob looking out the windows at his neighbors. Because the movie is supported by Bob Dylan, Bob's manager put us in touch with the photographers and their estates who documented Bob's life in the early 1960s. So we had access to every negative that had been shot in Bob's apartment. And we found a lot of unpublished photographs of the interior. Jim Mangold really wanted that space to be as authentic as possible. It's iconic. It's his first apartment. And we took that edict and we sort of went crazy and became completely obsessed with recreating all the details in that space. I mean, it wasn't really a set as much as it was a time machine. Imagine going up the steps to his apartment and then opening the door and then being able to look in every direction and open every drawer, turn on the tap, run a bath, go through the record collection, turn on the record player, play a record, go to the typewriter, see the lyrics that he's working on with the cutouts of the newspapers, clippings that he's taped to the wall. Go over and see the artwork and the furniture that he built by hand. Like he built his oval marble coffee table, which we recreated. He built these kind of janky shelves behind his bed. We had an old mattress that was spongy and that felt like cheap and poor. The floors were chipped away, peeling away, battleship gray paint with the oak wood underneath. It was just fun. And Timmy would just come in and just sit and drink it up and spend time by himself.
Your songs are like an oil painting at the dentist's office.
You're kind of an asshole, Bob.
For me, I think it was similar to how an actor really needs to be in costume to feel like the character. That set was almost like a costume in that it was an extension of Bob's character. It really felt relatable. You walk in, you're like, this is just a kid. He's a 19-year-old kid who doesn't know how to make coffee, who's ordering Chinese food from the restaurant downstairs and would have, the sort of the takeaway boxes and things. He's kind of a slob. He's a very relatable young man in this space. The other thing that we found is we absolutely recreated his chair. That is the wingback chair, even down to the way that the tearing is happening on the arms. So it was a labor of love. If you look at that movie, you can freeze frame and everything is exactly as it would have been in the early 1960s, even down to the Thomas Paine Award that he won in 1963 that shows up halfway through the movie. The whole crew really enjoyed working in that space because, we had a backing and trees outside and some of those walls were built. I spoke with the editor at the premiere who said that he actually didn't know it was a set on stage when he was cutting the film together because it was so realistic.
Yeah, job done, sir. There's this amazing typewriter, obviously, where he's writing away, and a record player and all these details. So these are all his possessions that you had to source.
We had an amazing property master named Michael Jordner, and he found, we can just, it's hard to find things that are 62 years old that look new. So he found the exact typewriter, the exact record player. We found all of the exact appliances. We found a lot of these pieces, and it took months, but also all of the instruments are exact recreations or sometimes vintage instruments. The microphones had to be the real microphones because microphones are actually instruments and they all have their own sound registry, and we were recording all of the music live. So Michael Jordner was just an incredible weapon in that he was just so good at sourcing all of these details and minutia to add authenticity to each of these environments.
Wow, I'd love to come on to the Columbia Records recording studio in a minute. But before we do, just visiting like the folk clubs in Greenwich City where Bob Dylan was doing these concerts before he was known, really. And there's one folk club which is all very red. It's got red and white tablecloths and beautiful red.
Gerde's Folk City.
That still exists? Is it still there?
No, that's long gone.
Okay.
And in fact, we had only about 3 or 4 photos of the interior of that club. It wasn't a very well photographed place, but we found a lot of direction through written texts, and Susie Rotolo's autobiography that she wrote described it. And that was an Italian restaurant that existed that was about to go bankrupt and then was resurrected by the folk community as a folk club. So the red and white checkered tablecloths speak to the history of the establishment as an Italian restaurant. And then we layered on the folk dressing on top of that. Like the stage is kind of like an afterthought. It's only about 12 inches high. It's only a step up. And, this red velvet curtain has just been tacked up onto the wall as a bit of an afterthought. So we wanted to evoke something that didn't start as a nightclub, but had evolved into that. The walls in there are like beautiful, like Havana-esque healing plaster. It's kind of a grande dame who's seen more successful times. And then all of the black and white 8x10 photos are all photos of actual famous acts in the folk scene that went through Gerde's at one time and another and performed there. It was a very evocative space. It was one of my favorites and beautifully lit.
Yeah, there's a lot of atmosphere there. And another place that was really so full of atmosphere, I felt like you could almost smell it, Peter Seeger's cabin. So this is the real cabin then, you just said?
It was an actual location that we found almost to the Pennsylvania border in New Jersey, and very, very remote. And it was an exterior set. We built out the kitchen and a lot of layers that spoke to Pete Seeger's backstory. I love that you say you could almost smell it, because I feel that can really help as well. And every time I have a kitchen in a set, I'll actually make a meal the night before. All of the appliances were practical in Pete Seeger's cabin, and I made a bolognese with lots of garlic and onions. You know, I'd make a mess and then clean it up, and the tomato sauce gets in the tile and everything. And Pete Seeger and Toshi, they built this cabin by hand. They bought empty land in the Columbia Valley and built a cabin for their families. They dug a well and they built this log cabin. And so it was very important to Ed Norton to capture that character aspect. In fact, he sent me photos of his family cabin in Canada as inspiration. And we found this cabin near the Pennsylvania border and added even the chinking between the logs, which it didn't have. Because speaking with Ed, he really felt that spoke to his character and the way that the log cabin was actually built and handcrafted. And the whole kitchen was built into the existing kitchen, which wasn't right at all. We ripped out the kitchen. We built a handmade wooden, hand-tooled kitchen. It was also, the house is sort of a work in progress and not finished completely. As, when you're building your own house, there's always things that are on the to-do list. And then on the walls, we added all exotic instruments from around the world from his travels.
Yeah, so we noticed sort of mismatched chairs around the dining table and this kind of purple fabric sofa and all the open shelves, nothing quite straight, lots of different objects that so lived in and so.
And layered as if it's always a work in progress. Sets are historical documents. And I like things that show a sense of time and that it wasn't all done at the same time. As the family's growing and the house is evolving and things are being fixed and made better and added onto. So
such a beautiful thing you said there, that sets are historical documents, because quite often these are the things that are logged in our minds. When you think of a 1950s house, you might think of a 1950s film before you think of, your grandparents' house or something else, because these are the visuals that we're seeing day in, day out, that sort of really fix in the mind.
Well, we talk a lot with Regina. We talk a lot about the backstory and when was the house built? When did they move in? And when you're doing a hotel room in the Chelsea Hotel, for example, and it's set in 1963, you're not putting furniture in there from 1963. You're putting furniture in there from the 1930s or the 1940s, which was when the furniture was made. When you're doing, the cabin that's set in 1961, you're not getting a bunch of stuff from 1961. You're getting things from decades before, and you have to think about the socioeconomic things and what they could afford and where they came from and where they lived and the style of furniture that could have been sourced in the Columbia Valley in upstate New York and all that kind of stuff.
Moving into the commercial world, the world of the record company, Columbia.
Oh, right. Yeah, so Columbia was actually 3 sets. There's the Columbia Studios Studio A, which is hallowed ground. If you're into music, you know that so many amazing, iconic acts were recorded in Columbia Studio A. And audiophiles can actually listen to these old records and they know the sound of Studio A. One thing that I learned that I didn't know is there was no way of creating reverb or echo in these tracks automatically. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to put a speaker and a microphone in the stairwell and then record the echo from the stairwell. So you're literally hearing the building, the echo from the building in the record, in the recording. And since we were recording all of these things live, I worked closely with the on-set recording mixer to try to get the set to sound right, which was something I'd never experienced before. We had real baffles and curtains and layers and a real hardwood floor. And we really succeeded in making that space sound authentic when we were doing the live recording. And we recreated the mixing board with the little needles that were moving connected to the microphones. It was a very realistic place, and all of the sound nerds who were on set, they loved hanging out there.
And the exterior of the Art Deco Gold building there, that's not the real Columbia, right?
No, that was actually shot in Newark. We found a really great Art Deco building on a very controllable street and dressed the entire street And then when you go in through those brass doors, there are all these framed photographs of famous acts at Columbia. Beautiful display in the window, and it's supposed to tell the story of actually a very conservative New York company who was recording much more conservative acts. You know, Bob Dylan was an unusual person for them to hire. They had Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand, and they were known for being sort of daring.
And all the records in the window as well. I guess you had to recreate all those record sleeves.
Yeah. We probably recreated 10 record albums by Bob Dylan. His first 5 records, I think we recreated 4 or 5 records. We recreated 3 records by Joan Baez. We recreated Pete Seeger's records, all with photo shoots and everything. Those are fun details to have to do.
So moving on to another amazing set, right? Joan's house.
Yeah.
A mid-century enthusiast's dream.
Yeah, you know, she was a hip lady. She was really, really hip, and she had hired an architect to build her house in Carmel Valley in Northern California. That was a very big challenge to be able to find architecture in New Jersey that was evocative of the West Coast. But we found this incredible house with beautiful wood-paneled walls and a lot of great bones and a great sunken living room with a fireplace. And we turned the den into her bedroom with a 4-poster bed and put in beautiful like beaded curtains and things and macrame and all these great touches. You know, we really wanted to show a classy character who was sort of dialed in, you know, and she had a green Jaguar convertible in the driveway. She was cool. She was a really cool lady. He still is a very cool lady. It still lives up in Carmel.
One thing I would like to ask about all the concerts, the Monterey and Newport Folk Festivals, when you think of what we're used to now with like moving images and incredible sets and lighting, it all felt so beautifully low-key.
Well, this was the beginning of amplified concert sound. This was a time before corporate sponsorship, and it was a time where anybody could afford to go to see a concert. I don't know if you've been to a concert recently, but you have to take out a second mortgage on your house. It's so expensive. This was a simpler time, and I wanted to connect to create a feeling of this community where anybody could go. You could picnic on the lawn, and you could have a great time, and experience a concert where you're very close to the talent, and the stage is handmade, and the graphics are handmade, and everything's handcrafted. We all wanted to be able to have those kind of experiences again. It was very evocative and kind of romantic, you know?
And your background is actually in music videos, isn't it?
I have done quite a few music videos, and I love working on music videos because they're so creative and so immediate. It's the director and the talent. At least maybe I've just been very, very lucky working with directors who have a very tight connection with the artists. So it's very, very artistic, and it's an opportunity to be very, very creative.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground there, and I'm so grateful for sharing all those amazing insights. Really, really congratulations.
Thank you, Paula. It was really delightful talking to you. You really paid attention. I love that you notice all of our loving details and all the ephemera and little things that we care a lot about. And it means a lot. Really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that insightful chat. You can take a look at our in-depth feature and film set images at filmandfurniture.com, where you'll find many fascinating articles on interiors, furniture, decor, and lighting in film, as well as where to find these items for your own home. That's all in our marketplace. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.